How can you learn to identify any painting style at first glance? Today, you're in for probably the most informative and useful video of all the ones on my channel. I've been thinking for a long time about how to clearly explain the changes in styles to you, and recently I had an epiphany. Today, we're going to embark on an incredibly fascinating journey, observing how the technique and aesthetics of depicting something we know best, the human body, have changed over time. There will be a lot of interesting facts, many of which I'm sure will surprise you. Let's get started. Painting, in essence, began with the depiction of humans, initially exclusively for ritual purposes, on the walls of caves, and in form it resembled the scribbles of a child. It was naive, primitive, and straightforward. Ancient people painted with simple, accessible colors just as they were: ochre, which is rust, charcoal, limestone or chalk, and yellow clay. They mixed the dyes with water, animal fat, or blood, and applied them to the uneven cave walls with their fingers or bone sticks. Try drawing something on a rough stone with a stick, having only 4 colors, and you'll understand why ancient drawings were so primitive. But we will move with you from the cave age straight to antiquity, because it was here, around 80 before Christ, that the first technology appeared that allowed images on the wall to be made more stylish. This technology was ordinary plaster. As you know, the homes of the Romans and Greeks were already quite advanced, and the uneven interior walls were further leveled with plaster. It was plaster, a thick watery mixture of limestone and sand, that became the first foundation for the first true painting technique in history, which would reign for another 1500 years. You've probably already guessed that this is fresco. The basis of the fresco technique is applying water-based paint to a still wet section of plaster. The paint is absorbed into the layer, penetrating deep inside and coloring the thickness of the layer in the desired color. The plaster dries in about 7 to 9 hours depending on the thickness of the layer. So the artist had to finish painting the entire wet section within that time. That's why complex frescoes were always painted in sections, like a mosaic. Of course, at first these were just ornaments to decorate houses, but as the technique improved, they became more complex and mythical scenes began to appear on the walls. And practically the first acceptable depictions of humans. And look, they were quite complex. You need to understand that painting on a wet and rough surface is technically not easy. The technology for sketching will not appear for a long time, and it's a very interesting technology. I'll tell you about it soon. That's why, as the painters wrote, when you paint directly on plaster, the paints spread, blend into each other, and it's quite difficult to paint small lines, clear color boundaries, or fine details. Have you ever tried painting with watercolors on paper? That's pretty much how it was. That's why the first images of people, which were brilliant for their time, might seem a bit rough and awkward if you look at them closely. However, you'll notice that they have full shadows and highlights, and the people themselves are depicted quite realistically. The technique of wet fresco will continue to dominate in Europe for a very long time. With the Roman Empire's reunification and the Catholic Church's rise in Europe, fresco purposes and subjects changed. They become strictly religious and are concentrated almost exclusively in churches. Everything was strictly canonized and standardized. Religious subjects were strictly defined and detailed, down to the angle, the tilt of the Virgin Mary's head, and the position of her hands. Therefore, painting at that time was purely a technical activity. The artist's task was to learn how to reproduce a set of dozens of recurring facial features of the Bible's characters, who always stood in the same poses, wore the same clothes, and had the same indifferent facial expressions. This is how some very first artists painted them. Once the church established the standard, it didn't change for centuries. You couldn't do it any other way, or you'd end up at the stake. At the same time, the background didn't matter at all for religious scenes. It was usually made gold or extremely simplified, so the frescoes themselves always looked two-dimensional and flat, almost like cardboard. This is what distinguishes the medieval style. Gold, shallow shadows, low detail, expressionless standard doll-like faces, and the absence of a background. Here's another interesting detail about how frescoes were created. Since they were painted in sections, artists tried in every possible way to hide the seams, but over time the plaster would still dry out and the seams would show in some places. That's why artists tried to make the seams run along the outlines of figures or clothing, or where one color changed to another, constructing a kind of mosaic this way. Frescoes were painted in pieces of different sizes and shapes. Each such piece, which, as I mentioned, could dry for up to 9 hours, took about a day of work. And now, art historians, when analyzing a fresco, determine how much time the artist spent creating it by counting the number of such pieces. For example, it took Michelangelo 4 years to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. This was determined because it consists of about 1,200 pieces. You have to understand that in the Middle Ages, rooms were simply made of stone or wood, there were no window panes yet, nor was there any insulation or heating. That's why the homes of the nobility and temples were damp, dark and cold spaces, where only frescoes that had fused with part of the plaster could survive. But it was precisely because of this that the first precursors of modern canvas paintings appeared, which were used in the homes of the nobility and were meant to cover the cold stone walls of castles. These were tapestries. At first they only featured heraldry, but gradually the technique improved and complex scenes with people and landscapes began to appear. Tapestries are important for us in this narrative because we are interested in their technique, part of which will be inherited by the next stage of painting development for making tapestries. First, a full-scale color sketch was made on paper at a 1:1 scale. It was called a cartoon, then it was placed under the loose fabric base of the tapestry, showing through it, and the weaver reproduced the drawing from the cartoon by weaving it onto the fabric base with threads. Just like when we used to trace pictures through glass in childhood, in the end, a mirror image of the cartoon was produced. It was the cartoons, painted with colors, that were the first prototypes of paintings. For the cartoons, not just watercolors were used, but tempera paint. A mixture based on pigment, water and egg yolk, which had been known for thousands of years, but until then had not found widespread use. And soon it would become the queen of painting, but not for long, only until the Renaissance. Gradually, castles and churches were improved, fortified and insulated, making the conditions inside more comfortable, and this allowed wall painting to take the next step. In the 14th and 15th centuries, dry fresco also became widely used. The technique was also known, but because of its short lifespan, the paint sits on the surface of the plaster and can peel off and flake away. It was not used often. Until the Middle Ages, a combination was usually used. The background and large parts were done on wet plaster, while small details and color transitions were done on already dried plaster. And here, the very same tempera was used as the paint. The paints no longer spread, and tempera had a thicker consistency, which allowed for more complex color transitions. But tempera dried very quickly, so you had to paint very fast, which imposed its own limitations on the complexity of color transitions. And as you will soon understand, they were the main technical limitation of painting. The dry method itself made it possible to introduce another very important innovation, our old friend. The problem with wet fresco was that you had to paint immediately, without a sketch, while it was still wet, with limited time, and it was very difficult to correct a mistake. That's why this kind of painting wasn't anything special. If you could recognize a person in the figures, that was good enough. Who cared about naturalism or emotions? On dry plaster, it was quite possible to apply a sketch, but just like here, cardboard came to the rescue. There were two methods. The first was the dusting method. A full-scale sketch was made on cardboard. Then, a needle was used to make many small holes along the lines at intervals of 2/1/8 of an inch. After that, the cardboard was placed against the wall and the lines were tapped with a pouch of charcoal powder. The powder would pass through the holes, leaving a dotted drawing on the wall, which served as the basis for the future masterpiece. And the second method was embossing. In this method, a sketch was made on cardboard in the same way, then it was placed on wet plaster, and a stylus was used to trace the sketch, pressing the lines into the surface. The first method was used for small details, while the second was used for simple, smooth lines of buildings and objects. This innovation made it possible to dramatically reduce the defect rate and increase the speed of work. It was this technique that Giotto, the forefather of the Italian Renaissance, used. With him begins what we are used to calling art. In 1453, Constantinople fell under the onslaught of the Ottoman Turks. And from there, streams of refugees poured into Europe, mostly into Italy, bringing with them what medieval Europe had lost. The works of Greek philosophers, who placed not God but man at the center of the world, and the ideas of humanism, or man as the center of aesthetic and moral order, had an incredibly strong influence on the artists of Florence. Their focus began to shift from exclusively religious subjects to the human body itself depicted in them, and Italian masters began to realize that they were depicting people, the same Jesus Christ, the apostles, and the Virgin Mary. Too standard, too mechanistic, too unlike real people, there was an incredibly wide field for improvement here, and Giotto took an extremely bold step for his time with his frescoes. He was one of the first to start using real people as models. Not to mechanically reproduce conventional scenes and images from memory, but to use real people from the real world, in order to transfer the human body and face onto cardboard as accurately as possible, and then onto the wall. And are you now looking at the characteristic style of the Proto-Renaissance? Look, these are still rather flat figures with almost identical faces in profile, but their poses, clothing and arrangement are already much more varied and natural. And in the background, objects and even landscapes start to appear. This is still very primitive painting, but in terms of depicting human figures, it's already a step above the Byzantine style. However, if you look closer, you'll see that the shadow transitions, which were always done by darkening with black pigment, couldn't be made smooth even by Giotto. And here, a technical limitation became apparent, which was imposed by the paint itself, a liquid, fast-drying tempera that became opaque after drying. And in the 15th century, painting made two discoveries at once, and they opened up two periods and two styles. The first is linear perspective. One day, the Florentine architect Filippo Brunelleschi was standing in front of the building of the Florence Baptistery and was trying to make a sketch so that the building would look realistic. Remember, all backgrounds before this were always flat, without depth. They were drawn right inside buildings, mostly from memory or from a rough sketch. And so Brunelleschi made a drawing of the building, trying to draw the lines exactly as he saw them, copying what was right in front of his eyes. Then he noticed that the lines of the paving tiles and the building converge at one point. He made a small hole in the center of the drawing, and it turned out to be exactly at the point where all the lines converged. Then he conducted an experiment. He gave people this drawing, placed them exactly at the same spot in front of the building, and asked them to look at the building through the hole on the back side of the drawing. And he stood in front of the viewer with a mirror. Through the hole, the viewer saw the drawing in the reflection, and then Brunelleschi would remove the mirror, and the viewer would see the actual building and realize that the building in the drawing and the real one were completely identical. In this way, he conducted the first experiment in the history of art and proved the existence of linear perspective, which seems so natural to us now, but which no artist could see before the experiment. Brunelleschi and the Florentine artists literally went crazy over this effect. For them, it was a real shock to be able to reproduce this incredible 3D effect on a fresco. For people of that time, it was a trick, an illusion, and with linear perspective, we entered the early Renaissance. These are still rather simple human figures of the Proto-Renaissance, placed in volumetric spaces with linear perspective. And the second invention is a new revolutionary technology that comes to Italy from Flanders, so familiar to us, but absolutely innovative for the Middle Ages. Oil paints. Oil paints were much thicker, which allowed the brush to apply a textured stroke. But most importantly, it's their transparent oil base, which allowed the paint to be diluted with oil without losing its thickness, while achieving different degrees of transparency. This seemingly insignificant difference technologically brought the possibilities of painting to a whole new level. Along with this innovation comes its companion, oil painting on canvas. Besides frescoes, artists also painted on boards, of course, and they continued to do so for a long time. The board would be the main material for non-stationary painting, separated from the walls. The same Mona Lisa was painted on a board, but the boards had to be specially prepared and primed. And for large works, in times when there were no easels, it was necessary to process and glue large surfaces, which required a lot of effort, and still it was impossible to achieve a perfect surface. Over time, the wood would deform, often destroying the artworks. At the same time, such paintings were extremely heavy, which greatly limited their use and prevalence. Paintings on canvas, on the other hand, weighed almost nothing regardless of their size. They could be easily transported by removing them from the frame, and over time, they did not lose their properties. At the same time, their size was practically unlimited. It was only necessary to carefully sew strips of fabric together and thoroughly prime the surface, which always turned out perfectly smooth thanks to the tension of the fabric. Therefore, soon canvas would win the competition, and painting would truly break away from the walls of temples and become an object of sale. A couple of decades would pass, and paintings could be created in unlimited quantities in any equipped room, transported, sold, and exchanged. In other words, painting is about to become a real commodity, capable of changing not only its location, but also its owner. Oil paints took almost a day to dry, and now it was possible to apply one translucent layer over another after drying, thus achieving effects that were completely impossible with opaque tempera. Oil paints made it possible to create smooth color transitions, which were so necessary for depicting realistic human bodies and allowed the High Renaissance to burst into the art world. It was this very technique, which he would later call sfumato, that Leonardo da Vinci would soon invent, using up to 40 layers of paint in his works, including the famous Mona Lisa. This is what gave the painting its romantic, smoky effect, where the boundaries between colors and objects seem muted. He would further blend the transitions with a brush over almost dry paint to make the transitions virtually invisible. Before him, this approach was explored by Botticelli, but da Vinci perfected it. He also began studying human corpses in order to achieve complete anatomical accuracy in his paintings. His characters became exact replicas of real people, with all the muscles and shadows so natural that for those times such skill seemed like the work of God. But aside from the perfection of the human physical form, there was still one important detail left: spirituality, which was conveyed through human emotions. Until this moment, people in paintings had always been emotionless, indifferent, but now the sophisticated poses and perfection of the bodies required matching facial expressions as well. Otherwise it looked unnatural, and artists began trying to depict emotions. Yes, that's right, emotions appeared last of all. And you can always identify the period before the High Renaissance by the detached faces. Voluminous, highly realistic human bodies with very smooth, almost imperceptible color transitions and shadows, placed in three-dimensional landscapes with linear perspective, emotions on their faces, and corresponding poses. That is, the combination of all the latest achievements in painting together, that is what the High Renaissance is. Let's once again turn to the technology of producing visual works, which have now become paintings. Workshops became the center of production, and I'll explain how work was organized in these workshops. This will be useful for us. Everything in the workshops was subject to the master. Only he could put his signature on the painting. He also usually painted the most important parts of the scene: the faces, hands, and bodies. The master rarely painted the entire picture himself, and there was no need for it. He always had apprentices who specialized in certain elements. Someone painted the drapery, someone painted the fruit, and someone painted the landscapes in the background. And there were also students who didn't paint at all, but handled technical tasks like grinding pigment and making paints, stretching and priming the canvas, cleaning, and so on. It is precisely this kind of organization and division of labor that often makes attribution difficult, that is, determining the authorship of a painting, because as a rule, several people worked on it at the same time. And to determine what was painted and whether anything was painted by the master at all is sometimes almost impossible. Paints were made right in the workshop. The apprentice would grind the pigment and mix it in the right proportion with the base, usually linseed oil. The production of paintings was concentrated in workshops. No one even thought about taking an easel outside to paint a landscape back then. That's why the trees in paintings from that time usually look too neat, tidy, and doll-like. Just like buildings or architectural elements, perfection doesn't remain in memory, but it's exactly those things that make objects real. Besides, it was quite difficult to prepare paints outside of workshops, and there were no means for transportation and packaging yet. For this, pig bladders were used, which was extremely inconvenient. The paints themselves were made from natural materials: minerals, insects, plant-based dyes, some of which, for example, blue made from rare lapis lazuli, were very expensive and scarce. That's why we often see paintings from that period in a very dark palette: brown, red, yellow. Because they were made from the cheapest ochres and cinnabar, which were thousands of times cheaper than lapis lazuli. In other words, in terms of paint, painting a blue sky in a picture cost as much as 50 complete paintings without a sky. And so the High Renaissance marched on with all this baggage, irrevocably changing the world of art. And as is usually the case, after discovering something inspiring, creative people get too carried away with their find and start to overuse it. That's why the High Renaissance is followed by the next period, characterized by excess in everything: in decorations, in overly dramatic poses, in facial expressions with extreme emotions, and in bright colors. This period is called Baroque, luxurious and opulent, as we would say today. And of course, after a period of excess, there is always a period of compensation. When artists finally realize that going overboard is not always aesthetically pleasing, and restraint in the palette comes to the forefront, along with simplicity and clarity of content and form, while maintaining the naturalistic depiction of the human figure. This period is called Classicism, and it will last from the 17th all the way to the middle of the 19th century until a few more discoveries are made and the revolution of Impressionism breaks out. But let's take it one step at a time. In the 17th century, the center of the art world gradually migrated to France. In the 17th century, France became the most powerful nation in the world, and its king, Ludovic XIV, was a fierce patron of the arts. Italy, which was fragmented and partly under the control of Spain and France, could not compete with the French Empire. And in 1648, an event took place that was extremely important for the future configuration of the entire art world. Ludovic XIV founded the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. It was the first art institution of such scale in the world. Before that, knowledge was always passed down only from master to apprentice, and each master had his own vision and experience, as well as his own views on painting, which he passed on to his students. The Academy, on the other hand, introduced certain common standards of painting that would be taught by all professors to all students. In other words, Louis XIV created an institution that, by bringing together all the advanced artistic knowledge, for the first time developed a unified concept of art, which became Classicism, also known as Academism. The same rules of painting were taught year after year, as is usually the case, becoming increasingly strict, conservative, and rigid, and this lasted for a whole 200 years. Painting plunged into a kind of suspended animation, a self-repetition, where only certain subjects and techniques were allowed, where deviation from the rules was punished by oblivion, and bold experiments were discouraged. The Academy soon gained so much influence that the academicians became arbiters of fate. That is, if earlier it was the church that dictated, now it was replaced by the Academy with its strict rules, which effectively froze the development of painting for a long 200 years. According to these rules, there was a strict hierarchy of painting genres, with historical painting at the pinnacle of mastery. These are large canvases with many characters, featuring complex compositions on military, mythological, or biblical subjects. Next came portraits, usually of aristocrats, rulers, and wealthy people. Portraits were considered less elevated, but likeness was highly valued in them, which essentially became possible only with oil paints and advanced techniques. Even lower was genre painting, scenes from everyday life, which would soon become a separate movement, realism, despised and rejected by academics. Landscapes were ranked even lower. As I already mentioned, in all times before Impressionism, paintings were created in studios, so most landscapes were painted from memory and sketches, which made this genre more of a pastime, a practice for painting backgrounds for larger works. And the very last was still life, the lowest genre, because it didn't depict people. Still life emerged as a way to practice technique for parts of large canvases, and for a long time had no independent value. Thus, during the era of Classicism, only large historical paintings and portraits were considered true art. In other words, if you see a battle scene, a mythological subject, or a portrait painted in oil from the mid-17th to the mid-19th century, that's Classicism. And everything changed in the mid-19th century when the Industrial Revolution swept across Europe and knocked on the doors of painting, changing both the technique and the possibilities. In 1810, the German philosopher, researcher, and poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote a work called On Color, in which he first described the color wheel and the basics of harmonious color combinations, as well as the influence of different colors on the psyche. But no one noticed this work. And in 1838, the French chemist Michel Eugène Chevreul, who was the director of the dye production at the Gobelins manufactory, wrote a scientific work called The Laws of Color Contrast, in which he stated that colors located on opposite ends of the color wheel are the most contrasting to each other, but at the same time are paired colors that create natural harmony. The colors yellow and violet, red and green, blue and orange. Why exactly him? Yes, because making tapestries involves the technique of placing knots of threads of different colors next to each other. The knots. unlike solid paint that was mixed directly on the palette before being applied to the canvas. On a tapestry actually represented separate dots, and sometimes, to achieve the desired color or transition, it was necessary to intersperse these dots with each other, so that from a distance, when blended, they would form the needed color. That's how he discovered that some combinations of such color dots are more harmonious the more contrasting the colors are, and the farther apart they are on the color wheel. He also described in the book the influence of colors on each other, showing that objects of different colors placed next to each other color each other through color reflection. And this will find its application in the reflections of Impressionism very, very soon. Around the same time, in 1841, the Industrial Revolution made it possible to produce something that seems very ordinary to us now, but was a revolutionary innovation back then. John Gough Rand invented the ordinary paint tube with a screw cap. Of course, it didn't become widespread immediately, but within 10 years it completely transformed the technology of painting. At the same time, by the middle of the 19th century, the chemical industry had learned to produce chemical dyes: blue, violet, yellow, and green. The violet dye, cobalt violet, was actually invented only in 1859. Before that, even its organic version did not exist. Artists used to get it by mixing red and blue, but the result still didn't give a pure violet color. That's exactly why violet was so often considered a royal color, as the rarest and most expensive. Chemical dyes, on the other hand, all cost about the same and were much cheaper than organic ones, while being much brighter and more resistant to external conditions. As a result, paints of all imaginable colors began to be sold ready-made, first in lead tubes and later in aluminum tubes, in all art shops. There was no need to grind and mix paints anymore, trying to keep exactly the same proportions as yesterday. You could just go and buy a tube of the paint you needed, squeeze out a little, close the cap, and leave it for years until the next use. But most importantly, tubes could be easily carried, and painting finally breaks out of studios, heralding the revolution of Impressionism. Before that, some enthusiastic artists, particularly the painters of the Barbizon school, also painted directly outdoors. Truly, painting outdoors or on plein air only began to develop with the appearance of technically simple possibilities for it. And some young enthusiastic artists, Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sesley, and Camille Pissarro, organized themselves into a group, as they called themselves, the Intransigents, who, armed with the latest knowledge, went against the 200-year-old rules of the Academy. They began to paint outdoors, but not at all like the others. The new theory of color suggested that under different lighting, daylight or evening, sunny or diffused and cloudy, objects acquired different shades. And they themselves began to see this, first in the bluish tint of the snow, colored by the reflection of the bright blue sea. Then they began to notice how any object is colored, not only by the color of the light that falls on it, but also by the color of the object standing next to it. In the end, it became clear to them that every day the light changes along with the weather. And you need to manage to paint the landscape right here and now, otherwise there might never be the same combination of light again. And Impressionism appeared, a style in which artists began to paint very quickly, sometimes in a single session, and the artist's brushstroke becomes larger and stands out as a separate part of the art mosaic. And only in this way, with a lively, quick brushstroke, could a painting be completed in just a few days. If Classicism required a painting to have photographic quality, with the brushstroke as invisible as possible, then Impressionism stands in opposition to it. That a person can be painted with just a few brushstrokes, and we will still see and understand the pose, the facial expression, and the mood. Mastery is no longer about the smallest, most invisible brushstroke and perfect resemblance to the original. On the contrary, it is about painting something recognizable and emotional with the minimum number of brushstrokes. Such a manner seemed sloppy and sketchy to viewers and critics of that time. But from this moment on, painting, which had been languishing in the captivity of academism for so long, breaks free and goes all out. The academicians fiercely resisted the breakthrough, but I won't go into detail about that now. Watch everything in my video about Impressionism. I'll leave the link in the description. For 30 years, the Impressionists fought for recognition until they eventually became the kings of painting, and academism was finally buried. The Impressionists were getting older, and a new, impatient generation of artists came to replace them, who saw the unprecedented success that the Impressionists' boldness had brought them. All ambitious artists at the end of the 19th century began searching for new styles in painting, which at that time was an unplowed field. This is the beginning of the post-Impressionism period, which brings together all the styles that painting exploded with after Impressionism was recognized. They developed in parallel, often intertwined and mixed, so from here on, the chronology will be very approximate. Our goal is to learn how the main painting styles appeared and what makes them different. That's why I'm explaining the cause and effect relationships in such detail, so you can remember all the styles better. During the last Impressionist exhibition, which took place in 1886, Van Gogh arrived in Paris. He was amazed by the palette and the bold approach promoted by the Impressionists, and he partially adopted their style. Check out my full video about his difficult life and the suffering that led him to end up in a psychiatric clinic. Cut off from the opportunity to paint outdoors, confined to his studio without windows. And he, as if technically going back 50 years, starts painting not only from memory, but also from imagination. Adding to his paintings elements that never existed and could never exist, whirls in the sky, rays of stars. This naive transfer of the imaginary onto the canvas will give rise to a new movement, Expressionism, in which the artist places great emphasis on his own experiences, invisible to the rest of the world, but which he is able to pour out into the real world, only with the help of paint. This style will be developed by the well-known to you Edvard Munch, who painted the famous The Scream, in which the figure of a person becomes completely unreal and fantastical, yet serves as a conduit for pure emotion. And this movement will be completed by Abstract Expressionism, a style in which even any recognizable object disappears and only the artist's emotions remain on the canvas, sometimes chaotic, indistinct, but representing the pure manifestation of the author's momentary state. Vincent van Gogh had a friend, Olga Guin, a French experimental artist, but one who took a different path. In 1855, Japan opened up, a country that until then had only allowed access to the Dutch. Both Japanese culture and painting literally took the world by storm, including Paris. The decorativeness and simplicity of Japanese painting captivated Gauguin, and not only him, and this had a strong influence on his style. In 1888, he painted the work Vision After the Sermon, or Jacob Wrestling with the Angel, in which he moved away from Impressionism and depicted red earth and simplified human figures. In fact, he returned to Byzantine roots and started a new branch called Symbolism, which is characterized by experimental subjects, a desire for unusual use of symbolism, ambiguity, hints, and mysterious and enigmatic images. And this branch is completed by the famous Salvador Dali and René Magritte, who took symbolism to the extreme, turning it into surrealism, that is, a completely 100% unreal subject. As you can see, all the branches are moving further and further away from simply depicting and copying the real world and people, mixing them with the artist's thoughts and fantasies, or even opposing the real world and the very idea that painting should be representational. Gauguin is also considered a forerunner of a style that brings us back to a basic, wild, and even primitive way of depicting people, opposing Classicism with its meticulous rendering of details and anatomy. This is Primitivism, which will be picked up and developed by Henri Rousseau and later by Kazimir Malevich. But alongside Van Gogh and Gauguin, there was another artist who was very fascinated by Michel-Eugène Chevreul's work on the color wheel and decided to actually transfer the technique of tapestries onto oil canvas. He studied the effect of mixing colors, but decided not to mix them on the palette, instead applying them as dots on the canvas physically, using different combinations of dots to create the desired shade, which is only noticeable from a distance. This was Georges Seurat and his new direction, pointillism, literally meaning dotting. The most famous example of the new method was the painting A Sunday Afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte, where almost the entire surface is made up of thousands of colored dots. And it was Paul Signac who completed and perfected this movement. One of the Impressionists was also Paul Cézanne, an experimental man, one of the few who tried to create a theory of painting. In his work, he wrote the basic principles of the new painting, where he said that, in principle, all figures in nature can be divided into three classes: the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. He claimed that any object could be painted using only these. While Seurat broke the image into dots, Cézanne tried to create an entire system. He laid the foundation for a new artistic way of thinking, saying that you can experiment not only with the technique of depicting objects and people, but also with their very form. For example, try to paint a face both in full view and in profile at the same time, or break down a chair so that both of its sides are visible at once. And this will lead us to a crossroads, at one of which the Avignon Maidens will appear, and the Cubism of Pablo Picasso, his creative partnership with Georges Braque, and the invention of Cubism, which began to dissect objects, breaking them down into simpler forms, the main one of which became the cube. And this movement will end again with a complete elimination of real objects and the human body, which will lead us to Abstractionism. A style that involves depicting pure abstractionism, abstract compositions, forms that do not resemble any existing objects in the world. Pure design, detached even from the artist's emotions. And the last great movement, which was initiated by Paul Cézanne with his decomposition of reality into shapes. André Matisse, also in search of his own style, combined the simplicity of Gauguin, the bright colors of Van Gogh, and the breaking down of reality into forms by Cézanne, and created his own style, which would later be called Fauvism. This style claimed that colors do not necessarily have to be realistic. A face can be green and a shadow can be red with simple forms. The color itself is meant more to express the emotion of the artist or the model rather than to match reality. In other words, Fauvism mixed colors and simplified forms as much as possible, while still trying to convey emotions. So if you see bright, simple colors and primitive forms, that's Fauvism. As you can see, in the end, all styles came to the conclusion that there was no longer any need to depict reality, real existing objects, or human bodies. Then there was also Marcel Duchamp with ready-made and Andy Warhol with pop art, who proclaimed that an artist doesn't even have to paint, it's enough to make a collage or use already existing objects. And let's quickly go over the styles once again from the perspective of the artist's own goals. Early Renaissance. I paint people without emotions, with simple shadows indoors, with linear perspective. High Renaissance. I paint anatomically perfect people with emotions. Baroque. I paint people in elaborate clothing, with exaggerated emotions and dramatic poses. Classicism or Academism. I paint a person close to reality. Impressionism. I paint a person with as few brushstrokes as possible, with colored shadows. Pointillism. I paint a person with dots. Expressionism. I paint a person with added imaginary elements that reflect my emotions. Symbolism. I paint a person surrounded by symbols and hints. Primitivism. I paint a person in the simplest way possible. Surrealism. I paint an unreal person in fantastic settings. Fauvism. I paint a person by swapping colors and simplifying shapes. Cubism. I paint a person by breaking them down into simple shapes. And finally, Abstractionism. I don't paint a person, but the shapes themselves. Well, I hope I was able to lay everything out for you in this extremely confusing subject, and that you now understand the differences between the styles. Believe me, I tried really hard. Write in the comments if something is unclear, and we'll figure it out. An incredible story, right friends? I have one request for you. I run this channel alone, and each video is a huge amount of work. That's why they come out so rarely. But together, we have the best art channel on Runet. That's without a doubt. And your support would really help me. Please subscribe, even with the smallest donations here on YouTube, or on Boosty, or on Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. And thank you for watching. Goodbye, everyone.